An emotional and touching story. A waitress burdened by her sister's illness. A wealthy heir trapped by his family's expectations. When a simple deal pulls them into each other's lives, the lines between truth and pretense begin to blur. In a world of glamour and deception, trust is fragile, love is dangerous, and some risks change everything. Before we start the story, write in the comments where you're watching from. The grand hall of the Whitmore mansion overflowed with opulence and tension. Crystal chandeliers glittered, reflecting off the immaculate marble floor, while polite conversations and controlled laughter echoed throughout the space. Henry Whitmore stood by the tall windows, holding a glass of champagne he hadn't touched, debating whether to flee or face what lay ahead. His mother, Margaret Whitmore, approached with deliberate steps and a controlled smile. "Henry, darling, it's time." He didn't even glance at her. "Time for what?" "To announce that my life officially belongs to you and father." Margaret raised an eyebrow, unbothered by his sarcasm. "Charlotte is waiting. This marriage isn't about you, Henry. It's about the future of this family." "Oh, of course," he muttered. "Because the Whitmore legacy depends entirely on my misery." Margaret sighed, impatient. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Henry stepped away from the window, scanning the room for an escape. He needed a way out, fast. That was when he saw her, a waitress on the far side of the hall, balancing a tray of champagne glasses. She was unlike anyone else there. The other guests wore outfits that exuded wealth, while she seemed entirely oblivious to the grandeur around her. Her hastily pinned red hair, her tired but determined expression, it was all so starkly different. Something clicked in Henry's mind. Not attraction. Opportunity. Before he could second-guess himself, he crossed the hall, ignoring the curious stares. When he reached the waitress, she looked up at him, confused. "Can I help you?" asked Rose Bennett, her tone curt. "Yes," Henry said, taking her hand. "Trust me." Before she could respond, he pulled her close and kissed her. The entire hall froze. The tray fell from her hands, glasses crashing to the floor in a cascade of broken crystal. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret was the first to speak. "Henry," she said, her voice a mixture of shock and disbelief. "What exactly are you doing?" Henry turned calmly, still holding Rose's hand. "Introducing my girlfriend." Rose's eyes widened, but before she could react, Henry gripped her hand tightly enough to keep her from bolting. He knew he needed to get through this quickly before things spiraled further. Margaret regained her composure, though her icy stare was sharper than ever. "Girlfriend? And you think this is an appropriate way to make such an announcement?" "I do," Henry replied, his easy smile masking his growing discomfort. Charlotte Astley, the bride-to-be he was supposed to announce that evening, stood near the center of the hall, her eyes fixed on Henry and Rose as if she could set them both on fire with a single glare. The murmurs among the guests grew louder, and Henry knew he didn't have much time before the situation exploded. Rose, however, finally broke free from his grip. "What the hell are you doing?" she hissed, pulling him into a corner. "Help me," he whispered back, his tone urgent. "Just for tonight." "You're insane," she shot back, still processing what had just happened. "I don't even know you." "I'll explain everything tomorrow," he promised, slipping a card into her hand before she could argue further. "Meet me, please." Rose stared at him, furious, but he was already moving back toward Margaret, who was striding toward him with deliberate steps and a glare that could cut glass. Hours later, Rose sat in the small kitchen of the apartment she shared with her sister, Amelia. The tray of shattered glass and the hall full of judging stares replayed in her mind like a bad dream. She looked at the card in her hand, crumpled from how tightly she'd been clutching it. "Henry Whitmore," she read aloud with disdain. "Who's Henry Whitmore?" Amelia asked, appearing in the doorway with cautious steps. "No one," Rose replied quickly. "Just an insufferable client." Amelia raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. She shuffled to the couch, adjusting her inhaler. Rose watched her for a moment, the weight of the day settling heavily on her shoulders. She should throw the card away, forget everything that had happened. But the image of Amelia, weak and fragile, was impossible to ignore. Against all better judgment, Rose made a decision. I'm going to find out what this lunatic wants, she murmured to herself. And with that, the next day, she boarded the bus. The small cafe in Covent Garden was bustling, its lively atmosphere a sharp contrast to the grandeur of the Whitmore Ball. Rose sat at a table in the far corner, her eyes fixed on the door as she braced herself for whatever madness awaited her. When Henry walked in, he looked effortlessly composed, as though this was all just another day for him. She rolled her eyes. Of course, he didn't seem fazed. He found her immediately, weaving through the cafe and sitting down across from her without so much as a greeting. "Rose," he said with a practiced smile. "I'm glad you came." She raised an eyebrow. "You have exactly 5 minutes before I leave." Henry leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "I won't waste your time. I promise." Rose crossed her arms, waiting. "I'm listening." He took a deep breath. "My family is pressuring me to marry. Charlotte Astley is their perfect candidate." He mimed quotation marks with his fingers, a rare gesture that hinted at his frustration. "But this isn't about love or even choice. It's about business. Status." "Oh, poor you," Rose said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You had to kiss a stranger to escape an uncomfortable dinner. Your life must be so hard." Henry ignored the jab, his expression becoming more serious. "I know it sounds absurd, but I need time. If I can convince my family I'm committed to someone else, they'll back off. And that's where I come in." "Exactly." Rose leaned forward, as if she were actually considering it. "You want me to pretend to be your girlfriend? Why?" Henry studied her for a moment before replying. "Because you're not part of their world. That's what makes it convincing. They won't see it coming." She laughed, a short and incredulous sound. "You really think anyone will believe this? I'm a waitress, Henry. They'll tear me apart the moment I step into your life." He shook his head. "I can handle that. And what do I get out of this? Other than public humiliation and a massive headache?" Henry hesitated for a moment, as though weighing how much to say. Finally, he spoke. "I know about Amelia." Her smirk vanished instantly. She froze, her face hardening. "What do you know?" "I know your sister needs expensive treatments," he said, lowering his voice. "I know you work 2 jobs to afford her medication, and even then, it's barely enough. You have no right to talk about her," she snapped, her voice low but sharp. "Maybe not," he admitted calmly. "But I can help." Rose stared at him, trying to read his intentions. He looked sincere, but she knew there was always a cost. There had to be. "If you agree," he continued, "I'll cover all of Amelia's medical expenses. Medication, treatments, everything. You'll walk away from this free of debt." She blinked, stunned. "You think you can buy me?" "I'm not trying to buy you," he replied firmly. "I'm offering you a deal. One that benefits both of us." Rose was silent for a long moment, thinking of Amelia, the money that never seemed to be enough, the sleepless nights spent worrying about the next crisis. Finally, she exhaled. "If I agree, it'll be on my terms. No unnecessary physical contact. No interference in my personal life. And I can walk away whenever I want." Henry nodded, as if he'd expected this. "Deal." A few days later, Rose found herself standing before the massive door of the Whitmore mansion. She hesitated before knocking, feeling the weight of the decision she'd made. When she was led inside, she was greeted by Margaret Whitmore in the grand living room. The woman's eyes swept over Rose like a cold appraisal. "So, you're Rose," Margaret said, her voice polite but icy. "That's me," Rose replied, refusing to let the older woman intimidate her. "Henry mentioned that you come from modest circumstances," Margaret continued, her smile tight and condescending. "I do," Rose replied smoothly. "And you seem to come from a long tradition of snap judgments." Margaret's eyes narrowed, but Henry, standing nearby, stifled a smile. "She's honest," Henry said, stepping in. "I warned you about that." Margaret didn't respond immediately, but the look she gave Rose spoke volumes. Later, as they left the mansion, Henry glanced at Rose. "You were incredible in there." "Incredible," she repeated, laughing. I think your mother was seconds away from throwing something at me. Yes, but you didn't back down. That's rare around here. Rose studied him for a moment, trying to figure out if that was a compliment. Why do you care? This is just a deal, remember? He hesitated, as though searching for the right words, then shrugged. Maybe. But that doesn't mean I can't admire your courage. She didn't reply, but something about his tone left her uncomfortably thoughtful. That night, while Amelia slept on the couch, Rose stared at the informal contract that had been playing in her mind. It was just a deal, a means to an end. But deep down, she knew that with each passing day, things were becoming just a little more complicated. The Grand Hall of the British Museum gleamed under elegant chandeliers, their light reflecting off the polished black marble floors. Rose entered beside Henry, feeling distinctly out of place in the expensive dress she had borrowed. Almost immediately, the stares began, subtle but sharp, like invisible daggers slicing through her confidence. "This is horrible," she muttered, gripping Henry's arm. He leaned toward her, his smile unshaken as he nodded politely to a passing guest. "You're doing fine. Just relax. Relax." Rose hissed under her breath. "You're not the one they're all gawking at." Henry didn't reply, though the faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth hinted at amusement. It only made her more irritated. As they moved further into the hall, Margaret Whitmore appeared, immaculate in a dark emerald gown. Her expression was calm, her posture flawless, but her gaze bore into Rose with an unsettling intensity. "Rose," Margaret said with a controlled smile. "I trust you're adjusting to our world." "I'm trying," Rose replied, keeping her tone neutral but firm. "I admire your courage," Margaret continued, studying her as if she were an unfamiliar object. "Few people would dare to step into something so demanding." "Yes," Rose said, her voice calm but pointed. "I imagine dealing with constant judgment is part of the challenge." For the first time, Margaret's polite facade faltered, though she recovered quickly. "I hope you understand that this is only the beginning. Our world isn't easy to navigate." "I enjoy a challenge," Rose replied, her chin lifting slightly. Henry watched the exchange from nearby, his expression a mix of worry and amusement. He had never seen anyone speak to his mother like that before, and, to his surprise, he felt a twinge of pride. Margaret stepped back, but before leaving, she fixed Rose with a sharp look. "Let's see how long you can last, dear." Later that evening, Rose found herself standing alone in a quiet corner of the hall, pretending to admire a painting. She needed a moment away from the whispers and stares, but she knew it wouldn't last. Her solitude was interrupted when Charlotte Astley appeared, moving with the effortless grace of someone who had been groomed for this life. Dressed in ivory silk, Charlotte exuded confidence, her smile sweet but laced with superiority. "So, you're Rose," Charlotte said, tilting her head as if appraising a peculiar piece of art. "I am," Rose replied, her tone steady. "Henry has peculiar taste," Charlotte continued, casually. "I always thought he preferred something more traditional. Someone like me." Rose arched an eyebrow. "Maybe he's tired of tradition." Charlotte chuckled softly, but the edge in her laughter was unmistakable. "You're clever. I like that. But, if I may offer some advice, this world devours people like you." "Then it's a good thing I'm not afraid of being devoured," Rose retorted, her voice calm but firm. Charlotte studied her for a long moment, then smiled again. "Good luck, Rose. You'll need it." With that, she turned and glided away, leaving Rose alone once more. On the ride back home, Rose stared out the window, the silence in the car heavy. Henry finally broke it. "What did Charlotte say to you?" "Nothing I didn't already know," Rose replied without looking at him. "I can deal with her," Henry said, his voice steady. Rose turned to him, her face tired but resolute. "You don't need to deal with her. This is all temporary, remember? A deal." Henry didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gazed out the window, his jaw tightening. "Temporary doesn't mean I'll let anyone hurt you." She let out a bitter laugh. "I don't need your protection, Henry. I can handle myself." He turned to look at her, as though considering whether to say more. But in the end, he said nothing. The next morning, Rose woke to the sound of her phone buzzing. Groaning, she reached for it, But when she saw the notification, her heart sank. The mysterious waitress. What is Rose Bennett hiding? Henry Whitmore's new flame or fortune hunter? She set the phone down with a thud and opened her laptop. The headlines were relentless, and some of the articles even hinted at her sister Amelia, questioning whether Rose was using her as a sob story. When her phone rang again, she answered without thinking. "If you're about to tell me to ignore the tabloids, I'm hanging up." "I wasn't going to say that," Henry replied, his voice calm. "But I want you to know we're handling it." "Handling it how?" she snapped. "They mentioned Amelia, Henry. That's crossing the line." There was a pause on the other end before Henry spoke again, his voice quieter but firm. "I know. And I won't let it happen again." "What are you going to do? Send them a polite letter asking them to stop?" "Something like that," he said, the faintest hint of humor in his voice. "Trust me." She laughed bitterly. "You love saying that, don't you? Trust me. Like it's that easy." "I know it's not," he said, his tone softer now. "But I'll fix this, Rose. I promise." Later that day, Henry followed through on his promise. He released a public statement defending Rose, directly addressing the rumors. "Rose Bennett is one of the most honest and resilient people I've ever met. Attacks on her character are unwarranted and cruel. She deserves better, and I won't stand by and let this continue." Rose read the statement twice, her heart pounding. It wasn't just the defense, it was the sincerity behind the words. When Henry called her that evening, his voice was steady. "Did you see it?" "I saw it," she said, still processing. "Why did you do it?" "Because it was the right thing to do," he replied simply. "You didn't have to," she murmured. "Yes, I did," he said firmly. And for the first time, Rose didn't know how to respond. Things seemed to have calmed down since Henry's public statement. The tabloids had backed off, and Rose could walk the streets without feeling like everyone was judging her. But she knew the peace was temporary. It always was. That afternoon, Henry invited her to a meeting at the Whitmore mansion. He had assured her it would be a simple conversation, but Rose had learned not to trust anything involving that house. When she arrived, she was led to the library, where Margaret and Henry were waiting. Margaret sat in a leather armchair, her gaze icy as it fixed on Rose. Henry, on the other hand, looked uneasy, as though he'd rather be anywhere else. "I'm glad you could make it," Margaret began, her voice sweet but cutting. "We need to discuss the future." "I wasn't aware your future depended so much on me," Rose replied, crossing her arms. Margaret ignored the jab. "Henry has responsibilities. You are, of course, a temporary distraction. But I believe we can all agree that this won't last." "Mother, stop," Henry interjected, trying to take control of the conversation. "I won't stop," Margaret replied sharply, her voice rising slightly. "She deserves to know that this little charade has gone on long enough." Rose remained calm, though she could feel her patience wearing thin. "If it's a charade, then why do you seem so desperate to get rid of me?" Margaret's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, Henry stood up. "Enough. This conversation is over." "It's over because you know she doesn't belong in our world," Margaret shot back, standing as well. "And you know this all started as a lie." The silence that followed was deafening. Rose turned to Henry, waiting for him to contradict his mother, to say something, anything. But he said nothing. "Is it true?" Rose asked, her voice low but steady. "Was it all a lie?" Henry sighed, hesitating. "It was an agreement, Rose. You knew that." "I knew," she replied quickly, her voice hardening. "I knew it was an agreement, but I also thought there was a limit. I didn't expect you to treat me like a disposable piece of your plan." "That's not what it is," Henry said urgently. "You're not disposable. Things have changed." "Changed for who?" Rose demanded, crossing her arms. "Because for me, it's always been real. I had to be there, endure the humiliation, carry the weight of being judged every day. So tell me, Henry, when exactly did this stop being just a deal for you?" He didn't answer immediately, and the silence was all the confirmation she needed. Rose took a step back. "We're done. "Rose, wait," Henry called after her, but she was already walking out of the library. When she got back to the apartment, Rose collapsed onto the couch, exhausted. Amelia found her there, her face full of concern. "What happened?" Amelia asked. Rose shook her head, trying to hold back tears. "I made a stupid choice. I thought I could trust him. But in the end, he only cared about what was convenient for him." Amelia sat beside her sister, silent for a moment before speaking. "You knew it was a deal, Rose. So why are you so hurt?" Rose looked at her, startled by the clarity of the question. It was an uncomfortable truth. She had known from the beginning that it wasn't real. But, somehow, she had started to believe that maybe it could be. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I think I wanted it to be more than that." Meanwhile, at the Whitmore mansion, Henry was alone in his office. He stared at a glass of whiskey on the desk, untouched. The conversation with Rose echoed in his mind. He knew he had made a mistake. He had known it from the moment he realized she meant more to him than she should. Charles Whitmore entered the office without knocking. "You look lost." Henry didn't respond, but his father continued. "Maybe it's time to admit that this plan has gone too far." "It wasn't a plan," Henry said quietly. "Not anymore." Charles studied his son for a moment before sitting down. "Are you willing to fight for it? For her?" Henry looked up at him, surprised. Charles rarely offered advice, and he never asked about his son's feelings. "I am," Henry said after a pause. That week, Rose tried to move on, but nothing seemed to work. Then, one morning, while walking through a local market, she saw something that made her stop. A poster was taped to a wall, announcing a charity event. Event in support of children with chronic illnesses, a tribute to Amelia Bennett. Rose blinked, rereading the words. Henry Whitmore's name was prominently displayed as the host. She stood there, staring at the poster, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. "Why is he doing this?" she murmured to herself. She knew the only way to find out was to attend the event, even if it meant facing everything she wanted to leave behind. The charity event hall was bathed in warm light, a mix of elegance and simplicity that surprised Rose. There was none of the excessive opulence she had come to expect from Whitmore events. This felt purposeful, genuine. She entered cautiously, trying to avoid the gazes that inevitably turned her way. People whispered, some recognizing her, others simply curious. Rose ignored them, moving to the side of the hall where she could observe without being noticed. Amelia was at home, resting. Rose hadn't told her about the event. She hadn't been sure if it would be worth attending. But now that she was there, something inside her started to shift. At the center of the hall, Henry stood on a small stage, adjusting the microphone. He looked different that night, lacking his usual calculated confidence. When he began to speak, his voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of emotion. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he started, his eyes scanning the room. "This event is about more than charity. It's personal." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Over the past few months, I've learned a lot about what it means to live outside the bubble I've been trapped in. I've seen what it's like to fight, not for wealth or status, but for something real. And that's because of someone who has no idea how much they've changed my life." His gaze stopped on Rose, and she felt the air leave her lungs for a moment. "This event is dedicated to Amelia Bennett, whose strength is an inspiration. And it's also dedicated to Rose Bennett, who taught me the value of honesty, both with myself and with others. Without her, I wouldn't be here tonight." The room erupted in applause, but Rose barely registered it. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to process what had just happened. Everything felt surreal. Later, when the event was winding down, Rose slipped outside to the garden, needing to catch her breath. The cool night air helped calm her spinning thoughts, but she knew she couldn't avoid Henry forever. It didn't take long for him to find her. "I knew you'd come," he said, approaching her cautiously. She turned to face him, crossing her arms. "Why? Did you think a pretty speech would fix everything?" Henry stopped a few steps away, keeping his gaze steady. "I didn't expect it to fix anything. But I needed to say it. I needed to show you that I'm not playing around." "Why now, Henry? Why all this after everything that happened? He sighed, shoving his hands into his pockets as if grounding himself. Because I messed up. I thought I could control everything, keep this as a deal. But I couldn't. Because you showed me that I could be more than what everyone expects of me. Rose stayed silent, and he continued. You think I'm spoiled and arrogant, and you're probably right. But with you, I realized I wanted to be better. Not for my family. Not for status. For me. And for you. She turned away slightly, trying to process his words. You used me, Henry. From the beginning. We used each other, he corrected, his voice calm but sincere. You knew that from the start. But it changed. At least, it did for me. Rose looked back at him, her expression softening just slightly. And you think hosting a charity event makes up for everything? No, he said quickly. But it's a start. I'm willing to keep trying. I don't want this to end like this, Rose. And what do you want? She asked, her voice quieter now. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. I want you. Not as part of a deal. I want something real. With you. Rose took a deep breath, his words breaking through the walls she had put up. There was sincerity in his eyes, something she hadn't expected to see. You're impossible, she muttered, shaking her head. He smiled, small but genuine. And you like that? She laughed softly, finally letting herself relax. Maybe I do. Henry stepped even closer, but he didn't move to touch her. He simply stood there, watching her, waiting. And finally, Rose let the walls fall. Weeks later, Rose and Henry were sitting on a bench in St. James's Park, where it had all begun. Amelia ran through the grass, playing with a group of children, her laughter carrying on the wind. She looks happy, Henry commented, watching Amelia. She is happy, Rose said, smiling gently. Henry turned to her, his expression serious. And you? Are you happy? She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yes. I think I am. He smiled, reaching out to take her hand carefully. Good. And for the first time in a long while, Rose felt like things were finally where they were meant to be. The small cafe in Covent Garden was bustling as usual, its lively atmosphere a reminder of how far things had come. Rose sat at a corner table, sipping her tea as she watched the rain drizzle against the windows. It was a rare moment of quiet, a brief pause in what had become her new normal. She was no longer just a waitress. After the charity event, her life had taken a turn she hadn't anticipated. Henry had helped her set up a foundation in Amelia's name, one that provided medical assistance to families in need. It wasn't about his money, it was about something they had built together. The bell above the cafe door jingled, pulling her from her thoughts. Henry walked in, shaking raindrops from his coat. He spotted her instantly, his face lighting up in that way it always did now. I hope I'm not late, he said, sliding into the seat across from her. You're lucky I'm in a forgiving mood, Rose teased, but her smile betrayed her affection. He reached for her hand across the table, his touch familiar and grounding. I had a meeting with a new donor for the foundation. They're excited about the next project. Good, Rose said, nodding. It's nice to know people are finally paying attention to the right things. Henry leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. You know, none of this would have happened without you. She raised an eyebrow. You say that as if I don't remind you of it daily. He laughed, a genuine sound that made the edges of the world feel softer. Speaking of reminders, Henry said, his tone shifting slightly as he reached into his coat pocket. I wanted to give you this. Rose watched as he pulled out a small envelope and placed it in front of her. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers tracing the edges. Inside was a ticket, a train ticket to the countryside, to a quiet place she'd once mentioned in passing. I thought we could use a break, he said, his voice softer now. Somewhere away from all this. Rose looked at the ticket, then back at him. For a moment, she said nothing, letting the weight of the gesture settle in. You really are impossible, she murmured, but the warmth in her voice betrayed her words. And yet, here you are, Henry replied, grinning. The rain outside softened to a light drizzle, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Rose felt like she could truly breathe. This wasn't the life she had imagined, but it was hers, and for that, she was grateful. She tucked the ticket back into the envelope and smiled. "Let's go." And as they left the cafe together, stepping into the rain, Rose realized that, sometimes, the most unexpected paths led to exactly where you were meant to be.
Subscribe to the channel and rate the story from 0 to 10. Thank you.